Just by way of introduction, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is the world's most widely adhered to multilaterally negotiated arms control agreement for nuclear non-proliferation, nuclear disarmament, and cooperation in the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. 5 yearly review conferences are held. The last such review conference was scheduled for 2020, but was postponed to August of last year due to the COVID pandemic. Due to the current international prevailing situation, states were not able to agree on a final outcome document. However, it was agreed that the first session for the Preparatory Committee for the 11th Review Conference would commence here in Vienna in August of this year, preceded by 1 week of discussions in the working group on the strengthened review process. One of the decisions that was taken at the review conference was to convene this working group to look at various ways on assessing the workings of the review process and to see how it could be improved across 3 clusters of issues, which we will discuss during the course of our discussions. So with this brief introduction, may I now invite Ambassador Viinanen for his opening comments.
Thank you very much, Tariq, and thank you very much all of the participants in this webinar. It's certainly a pleasure to be part of this, and I'm looking very much forward to the discussion we are going to have during this meeting. In the summer in Vienna, we had 2 meetings. We had first the working group on further strengthening the review process for 1 week, and this was a very untypical NPT meeting because the meeting was very interactive. Delegations were reacting on what other delegations were saying, which is not typical for the NPT meetings altogether. So in that sense, it was a very different kind of an NP meeting, very productive, very informative, and I think also very useful overall, but also for the NPT review process. Then we had the normal first PrepCom meeting for a new review cycle, first PrepCom meeting, and I think that the PrepCom meeting was quite typical for any first meeting of a review cycle altogether. First PrepCom meeting is a place for states parties to state their priorities and their aspirations for the upcoming review cycle. This is an opportunity also for them to raise the concerns on the implementation of the treaty and whatever issues they see in the horizon. And I would say the delegation certainly did this. They had prepared a lot of very substantive working papers stating their priorities, and in the statements and the debates, it became very clear what are the issues during this review cycle and where there are possibilities to work further, and certainly where there's going to be a lot of difficulties to agree on the matters. Overall, I would say that what was very clear in the PrepCom was that the commitment to the treaty and a full implementation of the treaty remains very strong. But it's at the same time very clear and very obvious that states parties have different priorities when it comes to the NPT. Some of them emphasize very much the nuclear disarmament part, as for some delegations, the non-proliferation part is the main part. And of course, I would say that all of the delegations emphasized very much the possibility for the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. But overall, I would say that we had a good meeting, we got to a good start, based on the working papers, based on the statements made in the PrepCom, and also partly on the papers which the chair was providing for the PrepCom, and also when taking in consideration the final draft proposal by the president of the previous review cycle. I guess we have most of the ingredients on the table which we have to work with during this review cycle in order to come up to a meaningful outcome in the review conference 2026. I think that it's possible. It's certainly going to be demanding. It's not going to be easy. And once again, Tariq, I think that we have to wait for the final hours of the 4 weeks we have available in 2026 to see whether there's going to be an agreement or not. So,
well, thank you for that, Jarmo. So I think nobody put any blame on you, the chair. Everyone was very pleased that you acted very professionally, impartially, and very capably. The fault was more with the states parties for not being able to bridge their differences and to agree on compromises. And we'll explore this a little bit further. So prior to both the working group and the PrepCom, you held extensive consultations in New York, Vienna, Geneva, and elsewhere. And as you mentioned, a number of working papers were submitted by some states. There was quite a bit of overlap in some of these working papers, showing that states were more or less on the same wavelength in general terms. So as you opened the meeting on the 24th of July, were you hopeful that this working group might be able to agree on some proposals on the 3 clusters that were identified in the decision from last year and in your indicative timetable, that is on effectiveness and efficiency, transparency and accountability, and coordination and continuity? And as you mentioned, we had a productive and useful interactive discussion, at least during the first 3.5 or 4 days. So I was wondering if you might elaborate a little bit more on this experience and your assessment now that we are nearly 2 months after that event.
When I was holding the consultations prior to the working group meeting in different formats, officially, unofficially, bilaterally, in group meetings and so on, I mean, there was a lot of convergence on many of the issues, and most of the delegations were very clear that in a way they understand that the challenges of not having an outcome from the RevCons is not dependent on because of the process, it's political differences. At the same time, most of the delegations were very clear that we could actually improve the process in a way that it would actually facilitate better negotiations and possibilities, increasing possibilities for an agreed outcome. So concerning your question, whether I was hopeful, whether I thought that it would be possible to get an agreement, yes, I'm always optimistic, and I always think that we should aim for a meaningful outcome when we gather people from different parts of the world to come to a meeting, even for 1 week. So of course, the expectation was that we could agree on certain recommendations. Yes, this was my assumption. And as I said, there was a lot of convergence on the ideas how to improve the review process. Most of them are certainly applied already, I mean, have been there for a very long time. So yeah, so that was my expectation.
So it seems that the prevailing good mood began to evaporate when the draft recommendations to the preparatory committee was circulated, and that's where some of the differences became more visible and protracted. And then you also submitted a draft decisions paper as well, decisions of the working group for the PrepCom. And it was commented by some that the mandate was to consider recommendations and not decisions. So could you enlighten us on the thinking behind these 2 draft documents that you put before the working group?
I mean, the first draft was actually quite factual, based on the recommendations and the statements and the working papers that the states parties had provided. So that was quite comprehensive altogether. I would say that the very big issue became very clear very early. It was about transparency and reporting, transparency and accountability, which seems to be the prevailing and the most important issue for many of the delegations. And there was a lot of convergence on that. At the same time, it was clear that at least, especially for one delegation, it was impossible to agree on recommendations or anything concerning the transparency and accountability. So based on the discussion on my first paper, I omitted some of the recommendation from that paper and put it forward to the delegations, whether we could have an agreement on these smaller issues, practical things, how to run the review process and so on. But it became clear that it's impossible to agree within the NPT on partial things. I mean, you need to balance out all the decisions that everybody is going to get something. And because I omitted the mentioning on the transparency accountability, then it was not acceptable for majority of the delegations anymore.
Yes, so you're right, and that's moving on to my next point here, that the problem area related to reporting, especially by the nuclear weapon states, particularly frequency and also the format as related to transparency and accountability. So in the end, there was a joint proposal by 4 countries, Brazil, Canada, Ireland, and Philippines, to preserve some element of transparency and accountability for the next PrepCom. But by late afternoon on the last day, unfortunately, many of the heads of delegations seem to have disappeared. And in view of the continuing differences, I was told that you had decided that the meeting had run its course and you had no option but to bring it to a close without there being a formal agreement on recommendations, but that you would put forward under your own authority some recommendations.
Yes, that is true. I mean, in the end, I mean, the chair has to make the judgment call when you are dealing with an issue where you can see that you cannot find a consensus on certain things. And you know how delegations play out this. I mean, nobody wants to take the blame. I mean, they try to prolong the meeting and seeking, we need to get further instructions from the capital, and these are my instructions, I might get something else. So it can be prolonged as long as possible. In the end, so I decided that it's going to be the waste of time of the delegation. There's not going to be an agreement, and everybody understood why we couldn't have an agreement on the transparency accountability issues in a way. So then I decided that it's no way to continue that situation and let everybody go home. And in the end, so I put forward my working paper, which is actually contains all of the recommendations I had in the original paper I put forward based on the discussions in the working group. So yeah, that working paper contains practical, it's to my mind, it's a factual summary of the recommendations which were made during the working group meeting.
Yes. So you submitted your working paper with the 26 recommendations to the PrepCom, which is working paper 14, available on the website of the PrepCom. So you might not agree with my following observation. With respect to many of the recommendations merely wrote up existing practices about time limits, what would be the mandate of the discussions under the 3 clusters and so on. And also reading the paper in hindsight, it's always easy to be critical in hindsight. I thought it would have been easier if they were divided in one group of recommendations for the PrepCom and one for the review conference. But leaving that aside, I think there were 2, from my point of view, very important recommendations in your working paper 14. The first one was for the chairs of the first 2 sessions of the PrepCom to identify areas of convergence and to recommend areas for focused discussion in subsequent sessions. And you did submit such a paper, and I'll come to that in our next part of our discussion. And the second, I think, was on the standard reporting format for a common reporting framework for the nuclear weapon states, where you specified elements on which the nuclear weapon states ought to report, and that 2 plenary meetings of the next PrepCom in 2024 and 1 plenary meeting in Main Committee 1 on nuclear disarmament at the review conference should address the reports of the nuclear weapon states in open and focused discussions. So I think these were, from my point of view, the 2 main gains. The others, as you mentioned, existing practices. So I'd be interested in your comments on my assessment.
Yeah, I mean, I would even emphasize even more the issue concerning the reporting and the accountability and the based on the reports. That's really the biggest issue on the table. But I come back to that a little bit later. On the process, I mean, it's easy, and I remember when having the consultations prior to the meeting. I mean, whenever you discuss or I discuss with participants in the NPT process, it's always easy to blame or complain that the review process is too heavy, it doesn't function, it doesn't serve the purpose, and so on. But when you actually are going to ask the delegations, what would be your recommendation? The recommendations are going to be very much, as you said, the certain existing practices which are sometimes implemented, sometimes not. So they are not so big issues which actually delegations are ready to agree and then or recommend. And then even agreeing on those things is going to be even more difficult. So the basic approach by the most of the states parties is that, okay, the review process could be run in a better way, it could be done in a better way, but this is a beast which we know we can live with that. If we are going to change something, it might be not in our interest. So delegations are cautious also to agree on certain things. Concerning those two things, especially concerning the reporting and discussions on that, I think this is going to be one of the main themes, main issues for this review cycle. And my personal view is that we certainly need to concentrate very much on this, and we certainly need to try to come to I would say, a substantive outcome on these matters in the review conference in 2026. I think that it would be unacceptable for the vast majority of the states parties not to have an agreement on this matter. This is a priority for the majority of the states parties.
That's a very good point, because I've noticed that even the countries that are part of nuclear armed alliances, members of NATO and others, on this point, they all more or less have the same position, that nuclear weapon states need to report. And I think this is one of the long-term complaints of the non-nuclear weapon states, of this lack of accountability and transparency, and commitment to implement previously agreed commitments, those that may still be valid. So moving on to the PrepCom, the first is a very mundane point, and this is regarding the seating arrangement, and I'm particularly sensitive about this at the time being with the IAEA delegation, that the chair should have access to the IAEA delegate at all times if the chair needs to consult the delegate. So the IAEA should be seated to the left of the chair, the secretary or secretary general to the right of the chair, and then to their right, the UN, because this is a meeting of states parties of the NPT. It's not a UN meeting, it's not an IAEA meeting, and two of the three pillars belong to the IAEA, so to speak. So this will be my recommendation to the Kazakh chair to look after the seating arrangement. But did you feel that you had adequate access to the IAEA delegation when you needed to and get their inputs as you requested?
Yeah, but this is a good question. I never actually thought too much about the seating arrangement. I mean, it was not a big deal for us, for me altogether. It's something I took as given. Sometime I wondered, of course, why there's an empty space between me and the IAEA representative, because it didn't make any sense. We could have changed that, but I didn't have. It was not a concern, so I would have changed the situation. But chairing a meeting, chairing an NPT PrepCom is for the chair is very, very much about having conducting the process. I mean, you have to be aware of the rules of procedure. You know them to a certain extent by heart in what to do. And the most important thing that you have to access to the UNODA representative who should know these things even better in a way that you can quickly ask, can I do this? How about this? Can I do that? That's the main issue. It's not so much on the substance when you sit in front of there, but then you need to have ample time to consult with representatives on the substance, especially when drafting any document. And certainly in that situation, I had ample support and ample access to the IAEA staff members.
So the NPT has its own rules of procedure, and they're not the UN rules of procedure. But even at the review conference last year, when a couple of difficult questions were put to the president, the advice from the Secretary General was to quote the rules from the General Assembly, whereas there should really be rules of the NPT. It was interesting that the entire PrepCom was live cast on UN Web TV. And even I didn't attend all the sessions. Some of the sessions which I was not so interested in, I attended from home, watching on UN Web TV. But there was no formal decision taken on this. Because this is an NPT meeting, not a UN meeting. So I'm not opposed to this, but I think we need to get the formalities correct for future.
Okay, I'm not sure about that. I mean, we had a lot of discussion concerning the rules of procedure when it came to the working group meeting. I think that we just followed the previous arrangement from the previous review conference and then PrepCom. So I don't know whether we needed to make a specific decision or whether we just run it the way we have run earlier.
Mm-hmm. So the work of the PrepCom was based on the existing structure of 3 clusters corresponding to the 3 pillars of the NPT, that is nuclear disarmament, nuclear non-proliferation, and peaceful uses. And then under each cluster, specific issues for consideration. So I think many people thought that we heard monotonous statements in the general debate. And there's also this question that you have a group statement and then a whole bunch of countries of that group stand up and make their national statements, which takes up a lot of time. And I think there were nearly 100 statements in the PrepCom in the general debate. And I don't think we were much the wiser, but many states, and I think even you said, countries need to have the opportunity to state their position, at least at the first session. So based on your experience now as the chair, would you suggest to your successor next year to repeat this or to find a way of saving some time in this opening session?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, I've been on the record saying that it's very important that the states parties have this say, and they have to be able to deliver a general statement in the PrepComs. You said that there was almost 100 statements altogether. You have to consider also that there are 191 states parties to the treaty. Only half of them, a little bit more than half of them, were actually in the meeting room. So I think this is a little bit concern for us also. Why were there not more states parties in the room? Why didn't they participate? Is that something that we should be worried about? Should something be done about that? At the same time, I think that the NPT review process is an opportunity for the states parties to air their priorities, assessment of the situation concerning the treaty, but I think also to address issues which are related to the nuclear issues in a more general terms. So I see a lot of value in the general debate. I would say that it's going to be, and I wouldn't go there, that I would somehow limit the general debate in the upcoming PrepComs. It's a different story. If we would agree, for example, in the next RevCon, that in the next review cycle, we are going to have general debate only in the first PrepCom and then the review conference, and leave it away from the second and third PrepCom. But there has to be a decision made in the review conference to dissent. Otherwise, I think it wouldn't be a wise decision. So my recommendations is not to limit the general debate in the next PrepCom.
Yes, participation has always been an issue, even at the review conferences in New York, where all NPT delegations and UN members have representation. Many delegations are very small, and some only come in to be registered as having attended, but they never show up. In 1995, for the Review and Extension Conference, there was a concerted effort to get more countries in. So at that time, we only had 178 or so states parties, and most of them showed up for that Review and Extension Conference. So as you hinted, and as we know at the PrepCom, the main area of fracture, as always, was on nuclear disarmament, and related to it, nuclear modernization and nuclear sharing. Another issue is the current situation regarding the safety, security, and safeguards related to Ukraine's nuclear facilities as the war continues. Also on the nuclear activities of Iran and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, among others. So unfortunately, the nuclear weapon states rejected any attempts to set benchmarks, targets, or timelines for nuclear disarmament, which in my view is contrary to what they agreed in 1995 and 2000 under principles and objectives and other such agreements. On NATO nuclear sharing, and I realize your country soon or is already now a NATO member, I thought this statement made by 3 states that NATO nuclear weapons had been seamlessly integrated into the NPT, I think was clearly stretching the reality, and some countries did push back. And Iran objected to references or to its enrichment activities. So could you tell us how you attempted to navigate between these different shoals to at least produce the first draft of your factual summary?
I mean, as you said, and as I said also earlier, I mean, there are different perceptions when it comes to the NPT and how the implementation is proceeding, different priorities and so on. And it was clearly highlighted in the debates. And certainly on these issues which you mentioned right now, it was impossible because we were not forced to have an agreement on this. Any agreement of any of these issues is certainly going to be a compromise where you need to have everything on the plate in a way that you can balance out certain things. That's part of the diplomatic exercise we are going to be involved in 2026 in order to find a common view, which is not going to be ambitious enough for some of the states party, which is going to be too ambitious for some of the states parties. This, I think, is always going to be the case. But as you raise these issues, these are very difficult to come to an agreement to. But once again, let's see what we can achieve. Concerning the factual summary, I tried to include most of the things which were said in the PrepCom. That's of course a daunting task because so much is said, and certainly there's going to be some kind of selection of that everything is not going to be there. Then there's also the issue that you have to somehow consider that whatever you are going to have on the paper is not going to be harmful, for example, for work which is done, for example, within the IAEA. So there are many things which you have to take in consideration, and especially because it was clear from the even before the meeting that there's not going to be an agreement on the factual summary. This is very hard to read. So that made those are the aspects which one has to take in consideration in preparation of that.
Mm-hmm. So as you said, and as also I agree that the strengthened review process is not per se broken. It may be in need of some marginal modifications, but when states want to agree, they agree. So the only time a factual summary was agreed was in 2002 by one of your Nordic colleagues, Henrik Salander of Sweden. His factual summary was 37 paragraphs. Yours was 122 paragraphs. And then in between, we had really lengthy factual summaries. And is it really necessary to have such long, because we're setting ourselves up for failure to agree to 122 paragraphs in 2 days or 2.5 days of discussions?
No, it's, I mean, there are, once again, I mean, I was initially going to say that it's not worthwhile. But of course, there's certain value in putting on paper what has been said in the meeting room. So there's a reference point at least, even though there wouldn't be an agreement on that. So then in that sense, there's some worth in that paper too. So it once again, this is an issue which has to be decided by the review conference. Whether we are going to adhere to the 99th decision that we aim for a consensus factual summary. If we are going to skip that, let's agree on that, that we shouldn't aim for that. Let's agree, for example, that we're just going to have the chair's reflections on the matters, which would be, I guess, much more realistic. But this is, once again, it requires a really thorough consideration on the pros and cons on this matter. So better not to rush to anything. This is a matter which we have to keep in mind when we prepare for the review conference, and we need to have addressed this in the review conference too. It's way too long. I mean, but once again, I could imagine that if it would be much shorter, there would be delegations complaining that what we said was not reflected in the chair's papers and so on. So this is always a balancing act.
Yes. So in 2014, when I was helping the chair, we did about the 17 paragraphs, although there were chunky paragraphs. My concern here is that when we repeat, first of all, we say that the previous commitments are valid from 95, 2000, 2010, and then some of them are selectively repeated, like the unequivocal commitment and so on. But in the repetition, we lose some elements of the original. And then countries begin to fight over it because they don't see this or that. And you will recall that you were criticized for the very first paragraph of your factual summary, when you said that the NPT is the cornerstone of nuclear non-proliferation regime and the foundation for the pursuit of nuclear disarmament. What these people didn't realize was this is the exact language that Henrik Salander used in 2002. Which they agreed to in 2002. So this shows that we have this loss of institutional memory, where previously agreed language is not known to people in the room. And then the chair, I'm sure you did your research and your homework, and you didn't invent it out of thin air. You were building on previous language, and then they attack the chair. And so I think this is, again, in my view, an argument for brevity to some extent. So continuing, so states parties unfortunately did not reward the chair for their, meaning your efforts to present 2 drafts of a factual report, and they rather attacked it with some venom and complained of lack of various balances, such as on nuclear disarmament in particular. There was paragraph 87 on Iran, which went into some detail on its enrichment, and I thought that maybe that was too much. And for example, could not that paragraph have been deleted at the previous paragraph retained on Iran and the JCPOA, so that you could salvage your factual summary? I understand that the chair was under pressure that in order even to get the report of the PrepCom, there needed to be a compromise, and you chose to exercise your prerogative not to issue the factual summary, but to preserve the report of the PrepCom. Is that correct? Or maybe you could sort of shed some more light on this end game of the PrepCom.
First of all, on the institutional memory, and so you're absolutely right. I mean, whatever chair, you always need to rely also on the expertise and the knowledge on the secretariat from the IEA side, but also from the UN side. And this is so very helpful. I mean, I don't think that there was going to be a chair who can recall all of the things which have been agreed in a way. So you must rely very much on the secretariat. And of course, I would assume that, at least for me, the basis you start work with is, of course, the previous documents you have at hand. And then you see, because there's a lot of repetition, it's going to be similar kind of issues, but you have to reflect the changes. So that's probably whatever the chairs are going to propose, that's certainly more, in most cases, very well thought through. Yeah, in the end, I mean, of course, paragraph 87, I mean, in the hindsight, it would have been better not to have it all together in my draft. But this is one of the challenges also in the NPT meetings. I mean, you are under tremendous time pressure. You work through the night in order to get everything there. You have people to take notes and drafting certain things and so on. And then something can slip there, which seems to be reflecting what was said in the room in a way, but probably not always thought about what are going to be the political consequences on that matter. So it became clear that for Iran, that paragraph was impossible to agree to, and then they were saying that they are not going to agree on the formal report of the committee, which would have meant that there wouldn't be any record that the committee actually met. So the issue was what to left aside. So then I decided it's better to have the report and not to have the factual summary, because the factual summary, once again, would not have been a consensus outcome document. It would have been in my name. So that was once again, the judgment call which I had to make at that point. What this matter made it once again clear for me, which should have been and has been clear also earlier. When you have a conference, when you have a process, and you can not have in the outcome document some language which is going to be critical, one of the states parties or one of the participants, because that states party is never going to agree to that. So this is once again going to be the reality when we come to 2026. There's not going to be critical language on any of the states parties, or not too critical at least. It's going to be much easier to criticize, for example, certain I would say former states parties to the NPT which are not participating in the meeting because they are not going to say their no. But if there's going to be criticism vis-a-vis certain states party, that's not going to fly. So that's the reality, which I didn't succeed in taking into consideration this time.
So if we look at the guidance from the 2000 review conference on the strength and review process about the first two sessions of the PrepCom preparing factual reports, it doesn't say that the factual report needs the consensus of the states parties. Sort of leaves it in the open. So could you not have exercised your prerogative and said, fine, you don't agree, I still, consensus is not needed, it would be desirable? Or you thought that that would be too provocative or divisive?
Yeah, I mean, that would be, the PrepCom cannot agree on anything, I mean, unless it's going to be a consensus decision. Of course, the practice, as you know very well, has been that the chairs have issued their factual summary and there's no consensus as the working paper. But in the end, this was not possible this time either, because the language was not acceptable even in that sense, or there was some political issue on that matter, so we couldn't do that either. Even if it's not clearly stated that it needs to be a consensus decision, I would say that the general understanding is there's not going to be any agreement within the NPT PrepComs or review conference unless it's a consensus decision. And I think this is an it's an important and valuable issue for all of the states parties. And even though that sometimes make our work very difficult, I don't see, I mean, I was contemplating on certain points whether we should have a vote on this matter, but that would be too drastic. It's better not to go that way. It's better to stick to the consensus in order to keep the treaty, keep it as successful as it is. So we need to just adhere to the consensus rule, even though it's cumbersome, it makes life difficult, and even one states party can say that they are not going to agree on something, and then we don't have an agreement. That's the price, I think, that we have to pay for this very successful treaty.
Yeah, so the outcome was that the factual summary is not available on the official website. But fortunately, it's available on the website of Reaching Critical Will. So this shows how civil society can contribute indirectly. So there are some questions from the participants, and I'll put them to you two at a time. So one question is to evaluate the present and potential role of the European Union in the NPT review process. And the second question is from Ambassador Sultanieh, former Iranian ambassador to the IAEA. He says, as rightly said, the chair should not be blamed for failure. Don't you think that since New World Order is emerging, we shall have more challenges and failures at NPT conferences?
On the EU participation, this is a very important matter for the states parties who are part of the European Union also. And then there's a treaty-based agreement within that community that there's a common foreign and security policy, and the EU should be represented in that way. I think that the way that has been solved or has been established within the NPT works fine, and nobody should have any problem with that. It's good for the treaty, it's good for the review conference PrepComs, and it's not taking anything away from any other. And I think that the EU member states would be ready to accept that, for example, if African Union would decide on similar arrangement, that wouldn't be a problem. But of course, because the political economic integration within the EU is much more, I would say, advanced than in any other cooperative arrangement. So sometimes it's probably difficult to understand that seeing from outside. I really didn't get exactly the question. I mean, to me, the treaty per se is a very successful treaty. It functions well all of the time. It has curbed nuclear proliferation for more than 55 decades already. It works well. There are certain mishaps, and it's not a perfect treaty altogether. It provides the international legal basis for peaceful applications of nuclear energy. I mean, that every country, every states party have the right to develop for peaceful uses. This is very important, because if we didn't have this treaty, there might be every now and then some countries saying that actually we don't like that you're actually having peaceful programs, and we challenge you on that matter. Now there's no way that anybody could do that. And we know from our national history that when we were establishing our nuclear power program in Finland, this was a major fact for us that we have actually international supervision for our nuclear programs. Compare that with supervision by coming from Soviet Union or Russia or of United States for any other country. The international supervision is so much better than having from a states party. It's the only treaty where the nuclear weapon states actually have agreed and committed themselves to advance nuclear disarmament. it's a major commitment from this, only legal commitment they have made to this end, and probably it would be very difficult to achieve on this. So, but having said all of this, review processes are always going to be difficult. They're going to be complicated. There's going to be more and more issues to be addressed. As I said, the treaty has the treaty implementation aspect, but it has a wider aspect on the whole security arrangement in the world. So therefore, we are dealing with issues which are in the core of many countries' national interest. Those are never going to be easy. They shouldn't be easy. We just have to work with that. So this is my take on that issue.
I think the point was that the relations between at least 3 of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council are in a difficult situation between China, Russia, United States in different combinations. And we only have one arms control treaty left standing between Russia and the US, and its implementation is quote unquote suspended for the time being. And so this doesn't bode well for the NPT. I might say on peaceful uses that with the Eisenhower speech from 1957 and the establishment of the IAEA, all of the cooperation in peaceful uses is through IAEA technical cooperation programs, which brings with it IAEA safeguards, a commitment to non-weaponization. So the NPT supplements it. So this interesting question where the NPT provides the peaceful uses, or the NPT, as you said, provides the legal cover to do it with the assurance that there is international verification and not bilateral safeguards, which used to be the original case. There's also a question about venue. Some people have asked, saying that there have been visa problems for certain delegations and other people, particularly for New York, and whether to move the conference somewhere else. As you know, I've been pushing for Vienna, thus far completely unsuccessfully. So if countries continue to have problems with visas and there's an issue with the host state agreement between the UN and the host state, what might be ways around this, since this is not a UN conference, but a conference of states parties?
On this matter, I mean, yes. Once again, I mean, this is an established practice which is very difficult to change. That we have 3 RepComs in different cities, and then we have the review conference in New York. As I said, I mean, states parties are, how to say, conservative in this sense. It's very difficult to change. We are used to certain things, and we like to do the way we have done. So I don't see much appetite to change this in any way. The visa issue is a real one. Last year for the review conference, for example, the host country went into lengths to issue visas for a very, very large Russian delegation, which then didn't show up in the review conference at all. So once again, the visa issue can in certain cases be a real one, and certain restrictions which are applied to some of the states parties are certainly, how would I say, make it very difficult and almost inhuman for some of the delegations to participate in the meetings. But I wouldn't play this up. It's a minor detail anyway in that sense. And coming back to the issue concerning the cooperation and the agreements between the 5 nuclear weapon states, it is clear that when something very drastic is happening in the world, that has an impact on the NPT. It should have. It's clear that it has. And of course, the dynamics within the NPT right now is very different than it used to be. I mean, the 3 Western nuclear weapon states, so they can differentiate themselves from the 2 others to a certain extent, especially when it comes to the transparency, accountability issues, where they have a little bit different policies than, for example, China and Russia. So it's going to complicate, but once again, this is part of the reality. things which are happening in the world are going to have an impact on international treaties and processes. I always hoped that the work which we do in the meeting room would have an impact on the real world. This is something that we should aim for.
So we often say that success or failure of a review conference doesn't mean that the treaty is failing. So we unfortunately have two successive review conferences that were not able to agree on an outcome document. And also now we have a factual summary that for the first time could not be transmitted to the next session. So in light of this, should not NPT states parties work harder so that in 2026 we have a success, even though it might be a modest success?
Yes, I agree totally. I mean, as I said, the treaty is functioning well. It's a very useful treaty for all of the states parties. And as you said, the measurement of the successful treaty is whether or not we are going to have an outcome document or not. But in our line of work, in the diplomacy, if you have a process where you have 3 PrepCom, 2 weeks each, and then you have a review conference for 4 weeks, that's 10 weeks altogether. You gather big delegations to take part in a way. So as diplomats, we cannot be satisfied with the outcome if we don't have an outcome document. This is something that we certainly should aim for and should work harder for that. And therefore, once again, I hope that during this review cycle, we would be able to have a little bit better preparation coming to the review conference, that it would be a little bit easier to agree in the review conference on the matters which we know are going to be very difficult ones.
So since we are coming to the end, I wanted to end on a positive note and to congratulate you on your initiative to issue the recommendations by the chair to the next PrepCom chair for potential areas for focused discussion at the second session. And you very conveniently divided your document into subheadings. And then under each subheading, you also indicated what would be the areas for focused discussion, as you said, in an open and transparent manner. And so elaborating a little bit more on this and also broadening it, if you were to give advice at this stage to the next PrepCom chair, what might that be if you could roll this all into one?
Yeah, I'm going to meet with the upcoming chair next week when I'm going to be in New York. So yes, I don't exactly know what is going to be my recommendation, but certainly one of the things which I think that he should consider is to have intersessional informal consultations with all of the states parties prior to the PrepCom. And as he's based in New York, so probably it would be advisable to do it in person in New York, in a way to have a sense on the mood, sense on the issues, probably concentrate on certain issues and see whether there would be some convergence or divergence of views. So this would probably be the things which I'm going to recommend to the next chair.
Okay. Usually it's said to focus on what's in diplomacy we call low-hanging fruit, so that builds confidence and trust to deal with more difficult issues. So the difficult issue still is nuclear weapons, and we seem to have some reversal now in the pace of nuclear disarmament. Nuclear weapons are being revalidated. There's also talk about possible use of nuclear weapons. So this is making the situation very difficult for having a discussion in the NPT context. And for the first time, the nuclear weapon states are not cooperating with each other in the NPT framework. In the past, they did, despite their problems. So I think here there's a role for the EU and other countries to try and build some bridges and compartmentalize the issues. if we link everything to everything else, then we're not going to make any progress. So how would you see potential compartmentalization in terms of preserving, strengthening, and enhancing the authority and implementation of the NPT?
Yeah, Tariq, you are posing so easy questions, so they're very easy to answer. I agree on this should be compartmentalized in a proper way as it has been done earlier. But we see with the current Russian war in Ukraine, Russia has given up this way. I mean, they want to link everything together in that sense. So that's one of the challenges. What I think is very important, it's clear that the international security environment has an impact on the NPT. It has an impact on the possibilities for nuclear disarmament. Having said that, it's also clear which are the most powerful countries in the world. It's those 5 countries which actually are legally possessing nuclear weapons who happen to be also permanent members in the Security Council. They have a special responsibility. They have a special role. I mean, it's not enough that they just complain about the international security environment. They should do their part in order to improve that security environment. And they are certainly in the position to do the most. We others, without nuclear weapons, with limited resources and so, we can certainly facilitate certain things. But it's these countries which I think bear the main responsibility in order to improve the environment and also to do concrete things in advancing nuclear disarmament.
Okay, thank you. So we are now at the end of our allotted time, and I would like to convey our appreciation and thanks to Ambassador Jarmo Viinanen for devoting his valuable time to discuss matters relating to the most important multilateral nuclear arms control treaty in place today. And also, I would like to thank him again for his professional and capable conduct in chairing the working group of the strengthened review process, as well as the PrepCom meeting that we have discussed here today. And this is not the end of Ambassador Viinanen's labors, because in 2026, you will be chairing Main Committee 3 on potentially an easier issue, which is cooperation and peaceful uses of nuclear energy, though at times people might hold certain items hostage there, pending agreement on the Main Committee 1 issues. So our next online event is scheduled for the 8th of November on new perspectives on nuclear arms control in a changing world. That will be held in cooperation with the Multilateral Dialogue of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Vienna office. The speakers on the 8th of November will include Ambassador Alexander Kement, Director of Disarmament, Arms Control, and Non-Proliferation at the Austrian Foreign Ministry. So with this, I would again like to thank Ambassador Viinanen for all our online participants and my colleagues at Atomic Reporters for making the technology work. Thank you and wish you all a very good day.
Thank you very much.